Right, I'm here with Sam Hazeldine. Sam, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about virtual reality and augmented reality in some of the more unexpected disciplines that we've heard of. So I'll actually, before we get into that, can you just give us a bit about you and your background? And I know you've done a lot of, you're a kind of go-to guru here at York for all these kinds of things. And we're going to talk in fairly broad terms about this. So it would be interesting to see how this applies to, higher education in general and just education, perhaps. But tell us a bit about yourself and how did you come to be interested in all things AR and VR?
So my background is actually as a primary school teacher. I was a primary school teacher for 10 years who did sort of specialise a little bit in kind of the use of IT in classrooms. And obviously have quite a background in sort of learning theory and pedagogy, and had quite a lot of responsibilities for that in schools. I started working at the University of York in kind of the area of digital skills, and sort of very interested to sort of see how we could start to introduce some new technologies into learning, research, teaching, etc. And then the project came along to open up a space called the Creativity Lab, with some funding where we were able to buy a decent amount of a very varied range of new and emerging technologies, including VR headsets and cameras to be able to record 360 and a range of microphones and things like that to be able to record kind of spatial audio as well, and thinking about how we can start to pile that all together. I'm really interested in how some of these technologies can enhance the learning experience, but also to think about some of the practical and logistical arrangements around some of these technologies, and what impact they're actually making, and kind of really drilling down into the purpose of doing something or learning a digital skill to start to introduce a technology to a certain area, and how that's going to sort of facilitate learning and move things forward. It might just be useful at this point just to sort of talk a little bit about the definitions of VR, if that's all right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So kick us. Well, let's do some definitions, and also could you tell us like where we are with the tech as well? Because I always think of like huge clunky headsets, which may well still be the case, but I think we are trying to get them into classrooms a bit more. So yeah, sorry, definitions, but what can these things do at the moment? So
we often talk about VR. VR stands for virtual reality. And in essence, it's any technology which allows to put a user into a virtual environment. That can be a visualized space, but it could just be an open, the ether or outer space or wherever. It doesn't necessarily need to be a place, but it puts somebody into a virtual environment, whatever that may be. There is a lot of discussion in this area around kind of the levels of VR in terms of the amount of interaction that the user has with things in that environment. You have something such as 360 video, which can be viewed, say, on a VR headset to allow somebody to look around a physical space that's been filmed, in 360 degrees, but you can't really interact that space because it is just a stitched together video to make sort of a 360 sphere. Whereas, we are starting to get to a point now where we have lots of consumer-based VR headsets, such as, the ones that Meta make, and lots of companies out there that are making kind of relatively not the cheap, but relatively accessible bits of kit, which allow people, with either controllers or hand tracking to be able to interact with a space, play a game, move objects around in that virtual space. VR sits under a kind of an umbrella known as XR, which kind of looks at a few different of the realities, as I like to call them. So we've got virtual reality, the idea of immersing somebody in a different environment. Then we have augmented reality, which is the idea of mixing together a real environment, usually seen through a camera. So I always like the example of, the furniture stores that let you view a virtual version of your sofa and put it up in your room and see what it looks like in your room, see if it fits, that kind of thing. So taking a virtual object and being able to see what it looks like in the physical space you're in. That's often what augmented reality is referred to, and kind of a side version of that is mixed reality, which is something we're seeing more, and this is where the technology is going. So lots of the headsets out there, including the one that Apple have recently bought out, is focused on mixed reality. So this idea again of seeing through cameras, seeing a real space. But you know, that space being augmented with virtual things, whether it's windows or videos or web browser or an object, whatever. But mixed reality introduces the idea of being able to interact with that. So I like the example of, you know, playing a virtual game of chess on a real coffee table. You know, that idea of kind of sort of mixing together what the space you're seeing around the real space and being able to do virtual things in that space thanks to some sort of technology. That's a really interesting one because not all users like the idea of being put in a completely different environment. So mixed reality is something that is becoming more and more to the forefront of where some of this technology is going.
Okay. So looking at some of the literature on this so far, it seems to be a fairly unanimous voice that there are learning gains to be had from using these technologies. The papers that I mentioned, that I scanned through quickly, mentioned in the classroom, and this seemed to come up quite a lot to my surprise, to be honest. So a couple that I was looking at were looking at the language classroom, which again was a bit of a surprise. I think when we were just talking offline, my preconception was that this was technology used for, you know, astronauts wanting to simulate what it would be like inside the cockpit of a spaceship, or engineers, but we're talking about quite literally down-to-earth environments for quite a wide range of disciplines. So how would we... can you talk us through a little bit about how we get these learning gains? What is it about this technology, and how would we see it in use in the classroom?
Yeah, I think it's thinking about... once we've taken the novelty out of things. So like you say, there are some really interesting experiences out there which engage people to the idea of maybe, say, trying on a VR headset or accessing VR. There's a few different technologies and way of doing it, you know, things being projected on the walls of a room, for example. But quite often the way we're seeing it used in classrooms is through access to either dedicated all-in-one VR headsets, as they're called, the ones where you put on and there's things installed on there and you can control them with the controllers. Then there's also the idea of, you know, something loaded on a phone that doesn't have all the levels of interaction that, you know, a purpose-built VR headset does. So it's kind of thinking about the technology that can be accessed, but then also having a good think about, you know, the area of learning and what's going to make a difference. So for example, one that's sort of becoming a lot of interest and a lot of conversations I'm having is around simulations. They're not easy to develop and to create. There are people out there that have developed some in some, you know, popular areas. You know, so health sciences, medicine, for example, you know, simulations being able to something that's maybe hard to recreate in real life, you know, a procedure or a certain analysis of something versus some of those other areas where, you know, being able to, you know, manipulate some dinosaur bones, you know, or an archaeological dig. That idea of being able to give somebody an experience that for whatever reason is difficult to do in the real world, but from experiencing that may invoke, you know, a thought, reflection, you know, an argument around a certain topic, you know, give them kind of a first-person perspective of something. So simulation is sort of seen to be an interesting one, but for a lot of areas, it's hard to get hold of the right sort of simulation that you want, you know, and trying to sort of build something is currently quite complicated. There aren't some tools out there that make it really easy to develop something from scratch for VR.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about how in some of these high I guess you call them high cost disciplines, like where, you know, with the engineering fields where people need to learn how to do things in environments where they wouldn't normally get access to, like the cockpit of a spaceship, or, you know, I suppose you could go inside a a human cell or something, take a look around, or whatever it is. Like you can see how that would be a real learning benefit to see in an almost tangible way what's going on in these environments. What does it offer though in terms of and the language teaching application I was looking at? I can see kind of the idea how if I'm being presented with certain objects, for example, learning vocabulary via shapes and objects being presented to you in a 3D environment would be useful, and repeated exposure to language and hearing these sounds being produced that would work really well. But then you're kind of getting into, it raises the question of you could do this much more cheaply using regular images.
Yeah.
So when we do get back down to earth and we're looking at more of the normal disciplines, how accessible is this technology, and is it financially viable, and can we apply it to things like chalk and talk lessons where most of the learning is normally done via a PowerPoint presentation or something like that? What are the what are the applications there?
I think it's a really interesting area. This is because I was sort of saying earlier about that sort of novelty of when you're actually thinking about what is useful in the classroom. So we are in a time where if you wanted your students to access something, say that was available on a headset, through an experience. Currently, headsets, we have some here at the university, for example, but getting hold of a set big enough, you do get a little bit into just the classroom logistics of, if you only say have 3 or 4 headsets, how are you going to sort of plan the session so that learners get access? Some of those logistics are important because if you are trying to get them to experience something, so for example, rather than just looking at some images, asking students to go through a procedure, for example, entering a lab or pressing a certain combination of buttons to operate some machinery, or, something like that, where we're actually doing the physical action before actually, accessing the real thing. I've seen some brilliant examples of some VR simulations created for almost like fire safety training in factories, so knowing where the buttons are and things like that, and how to operate certain complicated handles and switches and things like that, because obviously you can't do that, without invoking some fire alarm in a real factory. But in the classroom, being able to sort of training skills and steps to use machinery or to learn a procedure is a really interesting one. But obviously, if you've only got a couple of headsets, what you have to think about is if you've got to try and get groups of students through having a go on that experience, not everybody can do it at the same time. Learners have different needs and also need different lengths of time to be able to take something on, maybe need to replay it, maybe need to do it a few times, maybe need to access something else, or access it in a different format, which I'll come on to in a minute. You've got to factor all of that in, which then starts to make it quite difficult. You also have to factor in that we often find in the creativity lab, we give lots of people at the university opportunity to try a VR headset for the first time. And what we find is that some users just don't find them either comfortable or feel they can wear them for very long without motion sickness. Accessibility is a really important thing there. And I think we can often sometimes get a little bit excited by, trying a new technology, delivering a learning point or a procedure in a new way that often we maybe don't think about the needs of all of our learners. We always recommend, if somebody's created something for a VR headset, that they always try and supply it in another format as well. Yeah,
I mean, with the technology leading the pedagogy is something that it's definitely a case of, or there's a real danger of when you've got a new hammer, everything looks like a nail. And
I like that.
Yeah, I would be... I mean, it's definitely fascinating. It's interesting. As you were talking, I was trying to think of a discipline that probably wouldn't benefit from, because I might have been a bit hasty just now when I thought, it's probably the domain of science and tech fields. I mean, obviously, there's any of the arts and humanities, just anything we can bring things to life.
Absolutely.
Presumably, there are learning opportunities in there.
Yeah. Heritage is a fascinating one. Sort of all arts and humanities, but quite often there's so many areas where artifacts can't be accessed because they're in museums or there's conservation reasons or whatever. But the idea of how we can, there's a relatively doable workflow with the equipment we have here of being able to take a real object, create a 3D scan of it, be able to put it into a virtual environment, allow people to manipulate it, look around it. Something relatively simple, but actually being able to, interact with that virtual thing. I always make a joke about I want to create a museum exhibition called The Back of Things, because quite often when you have people learning about artifacts, for example, they are able to look at images or front of something in a case, for example, at a museum. But actually, there's a lot of interest in the underneath of things, in the back of things, and being able to create something that is completely rotatable, scalable, movable. People being able to interact with things in a new way, or look at it from a different angle, or a physical or metaphorical perspective is an interesting one, because you're giving somebody an example to interact with something in a way that isn't normally possible.
Cool. Okay. So the obvious question that I guess we've got to address at some point is how accessible is this to broader educational institutions? So we're sitting here, luckily enough to have a fancy creativity lab at our disposal. It's great. What about smaller educational institutions? Is VR and AR at a stage yet where restricted budgets and things can,
Yeah.
Not that we don't have a restricted budget, we do, but how accessible is this?
I think difficult. So as I talked about at the beginning, I sort of talked about the definition of VR varies and how some people kind of see it as the full interaction. There are cheaper options such as being able to watch 360 videos, something that's been around for quite a few years now, which is almost like a cardboard headset you can slot a phone into. That's very affordable because phones are relatively accessible, and smaller institutions might have some sort of mobile device at hand. And being able to, just slot something into a cardboard mount that kind of goes near the eyes to be able to kind of look at some 360 content for whatever. Google Earth VR is always a nice example of this. It's something that's been around for years. It's not necessarily new. But maps, all levels of learners, I find, love a map, and there's a lot of data and information and interesting things if the area of discipline you're teaching obviously kind of, relates to it. But maps are a great example because people can look around, get some different, building height data, and there's all sorts of interesting things kind of hiding in there. So something like that where it's just sort of looking around, looking at a map or a 360 video. But that is just looking around. If you're kind of thinking about it from a perspective of different types of learners, and the ability to interact, to take a journey with a particular experience, that's when you get into the world of needing a device which allows the user to have interactive controls. So usually either using their hands or the controllers. You're then getting into the market of needing an all-in-one headset, such as sort of like the Meta Quests and HTCs, and there's lots of other brands available. And then, you're talking several £100 for each headset. So, you are getting into the market of some of those experiences not being as accessible if you don't have access to some of that equipment.
Okay. What's the process where we create the material that is on these headsets? So I presume a lot of it is there's pre-designed, prefabricated programs and things that you can buy off the shelf. If I'm a learning designer or I want to create custom materials and things like that, how easy is that? How accessible and what's the process like?
Yeah, so it's something that in my opinion, I don't think is as easy. it all varies very much on whether you have some budget to be able to, either look to see what's out there. There are some brilliant companies developing some great things that they've worked in conjunction with educational institutions to build certain experiences as part of a research project or any other sort of project, maybe where there's been some funding, to support it. And there are some companies that develop specific simulations, as we talked about. I think the tricky area is if you kind of sort of have an idea, and you don't really have a budget to go looking for things, you are a little bit more restricted of what you can find. That it is possible to be able to develop something, particularly a relatively simple virtual environment where you can host things. I always like the example of kind of the virtual exhibition. There are some brilliant web-based tools which allow you, without much sort of coding or a games design skill, to be able to build a virtual environment and then fill it full of 3D modules, objects, websites, videos, and create that sort of virtual museum type room filled full of different artifacts that a user could explore around. There's some brilliant web-based tools which allow anyone to kind of build that relatively easily. So I always recommend tools like that because they're great for that. It's when you get more into a very specific, wanting to build a highly interactive, narrative or a story or a full, simulation that gives a certain amount of feedback or kind of gives the learner a certain amount of information as they go along, and it needs to be a full, complete experience. That's kind of when you get into the market. If you need to see either what's openly available or being able to, find somebody that could potentially, develop something for you if it was really specific. Yeah. And the question I always ask people is realistically how many people are going to access it? Because I think that helps you to answer the question: is it worth going down that line, or do you kind of stick with the maybe slightly restricted but the tools that you have easily at hand?
I mean, thinking specifically for language learners. I mean, if there's an open source platform available, the idea of creating objects for just vocabulary acquisition would be fairly straightforward, and presumably,
absolutely, yeah.
What's the open source community like around this? Are there portals where people have made stuff available and you can repurpose stuff?
Yeah, there is some. It's quite often trying to sort of, sometimes it's making a little bit of use of your contacts. So if you've got contacts in other institutions, other areas that have maybe kind of looked into things, something that they've maybe heard of or seen at a conference or, things like that. There's a little bit of word of mouth that kind of goes on a little bit, I find. There are some repositories and places online where people have developed stuff. However, particularly anything with, as I say, a high level of interaction, usually somebody's put so much time into it, there isn't that much that's kind of, people are willing to make, free and open.
Okay.
Quite a lot of sort of virtual environments are created in something called a game engine. So there are some free and accessible game engines out there made by a couple of the big sort of games developers. So there's one called Unity, one called Unreal. Unreal is made by Epic Games, who make Fortnite, the game. So they've created a platform that people can develop their own 3D environments and output those as a VR specific experience. It's quite a learning journey. It's something I'm learning at the moment. It's a learning journey to learn how to, obviously have some proficiency in 3D modeling, and it's quite a specific skill to learn. And thinking about sort of learning facilitators it's not necessarily something that you might have time to do. It's not, you quickly throw some things together in those, but they are very powerful if you can kind of get involved with some people that maybe have some knowledge.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not quite at the stage yet where I've got my headset, I've got some technology at my disposal, but it's not something that I can, get onto a platform provided by Google, Microsoft. It sounds like something Adobe might do as well. But they're not,
Yeah.
quick and easy platforms to get, if you have a basic idea for a short interactive experience on a VR headset, there's not a platform yet that you can quickly and cheaply knock up a program.
There are some of the big names are starting to kind of look at it. So Mozilla, who make Firefox, they create something called Mozilla Hubs, which is kind of sort of a metaverse space. And metaverse I feel like it's a whole other conversation, but the idea of a virtual meeting space is a place where people can be and collaborate is kind of sort of the thought around a metaverse. So they kind of create some tools where you can create a little virtual environment and host things in there.
Okay, I suppose this is the inevitable question I've got to get in at some point. But how is AI interacting with all this at the moment? Is this helping? Or given the production of some of these games a boost?
Something I'd like to see a little bit more of is there are a few tools that kind of do this, but all the ones I found not particularly well is being able to use AI to quickly generate a small virtual environment. So rather than thinking, I kind of want to create a quick environment that I can host some 3D artifacts for my students to be able to explore or rearrange or pile up or whatever. The idea of being able to quickly develop, AI can generate, a woodland scene, for example, without, thinking how you would create that, or, only use images which might not have the 3D effect that might make something feel realistic. So AI is starting to be useful in that area, but I think the development of 3D generative AI, for example, is something that is sort of just starting to appear. I've noticed in the last few weeks, a couple more websites have started to appear where you can 3D generate objects, for example, rather than modelling them yourself. There's some of that starting to appear, but I think there's still quite a journey to go in terms of being able to use, for example, generative AI to be able to put something together that would be relatively then easy to put into a headset that you could do. That doesn't really exist as I've found yet.
It all seems to be moving so fast that you can't help but think that this is something that's coming down the line. I mean, if you can, I'm not sure where we are with this now, but you can fairly straightforwardly turn images into video or using AI, and if you similarly give it a video file and say, please turn this into a 3D model. You have to say please. I tend to say please. I get ribbed for this a bit.
Never hurts to be polite.
No, but presumably that's in the pipeline. I mean, we'll be at a stage in the not too distant future where the labour involved in creating 3D environments is going to be farmed out to AI, and we'll be able to build them reasonably swiftly.
Yeah, it's something I probably need to do a little bit more reading on, but yeah, it's something I would expect that as we're seeing, more and more of the generative AI being able to create some pretty great stuff when it comes to image, video, text, for example. I'd expect, there to be further development in the area of kind of 3D spaces. And what I'd really like to see, and I don't know when we'll see this, but something that is able to build in some relatively basic interactivity, because I'm really keen on on the idea that if we're using VR or some kind of reality, that it's an environment that's created that has impact, adds to the the value of and the quality of the learning experience, but also kind of whether it's something that is realistic or not, but it doesn't feel like it's generated by AI, if you see what I mean. We often see a lot of images that AI are generated which just look a bit of a mess, don't they? I saw an image the other day where sort of those plant pots, but the plants were floating about a metre in the air because it had not quite worked out that they were connected.
I think, I've at the time of recording, I should really just say this, we were talking about this in February 2024, and I was just watching a couple of days ago the first AI generated music video, which was no, it can't be the first. I'm sure. Sorry, I'm probably doing a massive disservice here, but it was, so I've just been watching the Dandy Warhol's new single. I forget the title. It was something odd, but anyway, I'll post the link. But the whole video is AI generated, and this is, you know, it's new enough that it's caused some controversy. But when you look at it, in some ways it's spectacular and it looks beautiful and it's incredibly atmospheric, and you know the technology is just stunning. But at least to our February 2024 eyes, but it still looks AI generated. There are so many giveaway signs, like the way faces are constructed. They still, you know, they're getting fingers and hands confused, and they still haven't got text right.
Yeah.
You know, seems very hard to get text right on AI image generators. But it's the speed of change at this is just I don't know if Sam Altman's going to get his $300 trillion that he wanted or whatever it was for. But yeah, you can see how this is going to speed up and just
very much so. And I think from my personal experience, I think when I am you know, accessing some sort of learning material and I see something where it's quite obvious that it's something been generated by AI, you know, if it's an image or an environment or whatever of value, then you probably, you know, you don't really care because it's just, you know, background, for example. But if it's kind of the main content and it's particularly inaccurate, I worry that it gets a little bit into the area of kind of almost devaluing that experience a little bit, or maybe you know, the learners maybe might not take something quite as seriously if it's obvious that it's something that's kind of, you know, been generated and feels a little bit more generic than a, you know, a custom kind of learning experience. So I think you know, I have not done any research in this. I'm not an expert on this. I think, but I'd be interested to see if somebody did do a little bit of a study around the use of some of AI generated content and whether it does have any difference on, you know, how learners engage with something. I'd be interested to know.
Yeah. So where are we generally with this? It sounds like from the reading that we've done, it looks like AR and VR are things that are gaining traction, particularly in higher education, but not limited to. And do you see this becoming more mainstream, more accessible, more, you know, widely available as some of the things we talked about here
I do.
You know, develop?
Yeah, I do. I think as more and more places and more projects kind of, you know, have maybe got hold of some VR equipment, and more things have kind of been developed. I think it's still an area where there are some brilliant studies out there where people have looked at the impact of the use of VR, and some of them come up with some really interesting things. But I think as it continues to be around, we'll see more and more of this idea of mixed reality, of, you know, that mixture between real life environments and virtual objects. You know, I don't think we'll get to a point, certainly anytime soon, where the majority of our users all have their own headsets, you know, like a smartphone. I think maybe, I'm not sure that will happen sort of instantly or at all. But I think it's maybe one that people will continue to engage with, because it gives them really exciting opportunities to be able to tell stories in new ways, to be able to expose somebody to something that maybe is difficult to. You know, there's a number of reasons where it's a really valid technology. Simulations and providing quite thought and feeling provoking experiences can really add to impact. So we will see that more and more, and we will see people pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and what this technology is used well for. We see some brilliant experiences out there already, you know, that kind of tell some rather hard-hitting, gritty stories. I like one that's available on some headsets called Notes on Blindness, which tells the story of somebody in the 1970s who lost his vision and recorded cassette tapes that's been turned into a VR experience of helping users to see what it's like to lose your vision, and instead of seeing things, you see sounds. And there's some really great artistic and developer approaches to telling new stories and experiences that are otherwise quite difficult to tell in a visual way. But I think we just, as we've talked about, we just need to be careful that shoehorning everything into this kind of visual access through a headset type approach is difficult. But I think as we start to see new wearable technology come along that's lighter, that's smaller, that's maybe easier to wear, that maybe gets over some of the current issues of putting quite a big, chunky, heavy device on your head, or adding in that mixed reality where people can still see the environment around them and they're not completely shut off. I think that's going to broaden the amount of people that feel like they can access the technology and some of the things out there.
Yeah, so I think even if I was picturing it, even if all of this technology became freely available and everyone had a headset and access to the stuff tomorrow, I would see it as a supplement to teaching practice rather than a replacement. I can't imagine everyone suddenly becoming fully immersed.
Absolutely, I think it's an individual sort of section where a VR or a mixed reality experience could be used to enhance a learning point or a certain thing. That there are ideas out there that take it further in terms of how you could facilitate, say, a whole classroom environment in a virtual space. That there are some of those thoughts kind of happening. But I think it's. In my personal opinion, I think it's good to be used in conjunction with a mixture of different teaching techniques.
Nice. Okay. Right. So where's the best place for people to keep up with this? If people are interested in, this strikes a chord, are there any sort of publishing outlets or sites that or communities people can get involved in and keep up to date?
Some of the I will admit I watch quite a lot of sort of tech YouTubers. You sometimes have to be slightly aware of kind of that person's background or what perspective they're kind of sharing information from. But there is some really interesting stuff on there. And keeping an eye through some published journals. There are some really interesting ones. So I kind of every month or so I kind of have a look to see what journals have come out recently and what papers people have submitted, particularly around mixed reality and VR, and how education and learning through this technology is kind of discussed. I think is one we need to keep reading about and get a better idea of.
Has it got a dedicated journal yet? Have we got?
It doesn't have a dedicated journal. It appears quite not that I know of. Maybe it does. Not that I've come across, but it appears in quite a lot of other journals. Usually discipline specific ones. But yeah, I have not seen a dedicated one. Not sure.
All right, there's a space for that and someone there. Nice. All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Sam, for your time. This has been really interesting.
Thank you.
Speak again. Thanks a lot.